The roof collapsed at 11:47 at night, and the sound it made was something James would carry inside him for the rest of his life. He stood at the gate of his own property and watched 30 years of his family's history fold inward in a single breathless second, timber beams splitting apart, windows bursting outward, and orange flame pouring through every gap in the walls like something furious and alive and completely beyond stopping. Fire trucks packed the service road. Emergency lights painted the rising smoke in pulses of red and blue. Neighbors had gathered in quiet clusters behind the yellow tape, some pressing their hands over their mouths, others simply unable to look away from the scale of what was happening right in front of them. One person in that crowd was not shocked. Across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a long dark coat, stood the president of the West Briar Estates Homeowners Association. She was not covering her mouth. She was not staring in disbelief. For one unguarded moment, just long enough for a camera James had quietly installed 3 weeks earlier to record it, her face arranged itself into an expression of pure, cold satisfaction. She believed every document proving his ownership had burned with the house. She believed every camera on the property had already been destroyed. She believed that by morning, the man she had spent nearly 2 years trying to destroy would have absolutely nothing left. She was completely wrong about all three. James had lived on that hillside for most of his adult life, in a house his father built by hand more than 30 years earlier, on a private parcel at the western edge of what would later become West Briar Estates. The gated community had been carved into the Colorado foothills long after that foundation was already poured, and the boundary line that separated his land from the association had been drawn with complete clarity from the very beginning. His deed was clean, his title was unambiguous, and for nearly 30 decades not a single neighbor had ever questioned any of it. James worked long and demanding hours inside the county court system. His neighbors had always assumed he was some quiet administrator who filed paperwork and kept irregular schedules, and James had never once felt the need to correct that impression. He maintained his property carefully, kept largely to himself, and allowed the association to operate entirely on its own side of the line, without interference. The previous HOA president, a retired school teacher named Harold, was a measured and reasonable man who understood instinctively that mutual respect between neighbors was worth infinitely more than any bylaw he could ever force someone to follow. Under Harold, the boundary separating James's private parcel from the rest of the community was simply an accepted fact, acknowledged quietly and never once disturbed. Then Vanessa won the presidency by the narrowest possible margin, and everything that had been settled began to come apart. Vanessa arrived at James's gate one morning without any appointment, without any notice, and without a single shred of legal authority to justify what she was doing. 2 board members trailed behind her as she walked the perimeter of his private land and declared with absolute confidence that his wooden fence, his storage shed, and his gravel driveway all violated the community's aesthetic standards. James listened to every word without interrupting her once. Then he asked her, calmly and directly, to identify the specific bylaw that granted the association any authority whatsoever over land it did not own. She had no such bylaw to produce. What she offered instead was a flat personal assertion that any property visible from Westbriar Estates automatically fell under her jurisdiction, regardless of what any deed or boundary map had to say about it. James handed her a county plat map. The boundary line was drawn in plain black ink. His parcel sat entirely outside association territory. Vanessa glanced at it for no more than 3 seconds before dismissing it entirely. The following morning, a fine notice appeared in his mailbox, $500 for refusing an inspection he had never once agreed to permit. 3 days after that, the fine had already climbed to $1,500, with a letter warning it would keep rising until he complied. James photographed every single envelope and began building his case. The pressure against James intensified steadily with every passing week, and Vanessa showed no sign of slowing down. Fines arrived for pine trees she claimed were planted too tall, for a roof that had naturally darkened with age, for parking his own truck on his own gravel driveway, and for failing to fly a flag bearing the community's official crest. James never paid a single one. He logged every notice by date and continued building his private archive with methodical patience. At a packed community meeting, Vanessa announced that James owed the association more than $18,000 and threatened to place a formal lien against his property. When James stood before the board and asked the secretary to locate the specific bylaw authorizing fines against someone who had never once been a member, the room went completely silent. No one could find it. Association trucks began appearing outside his gate to block his driveway. Maintenance crews cut back branches over his fence line without permission. Then one of his cameras caught Vanessa outside his property well past midnight, spray painting the lens with black paint. The next morning brought an envelope with no return address, a photograph of his house, and a handwritten warning that old things had a way of disappearing in fire. James handed it directly to the sheriff's office and kept building. 3 weeks after the fire, Vanessa filed an emergency petition with the county court demanding immediate control over James's scorched land. She was completely certain that a man who had lost his home, his records, and his resources could never hope to match her attorney in any courtroom. What she had never once thought to check was who actually sat at the head of that court. Every letter she had ever sent him carried only the initials J. Avery. The chief judge of Silver Ridge District Court had been her quiet neighbor on the wooded hillside the entire time. The courtroom filled with association members, local reporters, and neighbors drawn by circulating rumors. Vanessa sat beside her attorney, composed and entirely certain of the outcome. She watched the defendant's entrance, expecting to see someone broken and defeated. Instead, the door behind the judge's bench swung open. James stepped through it, wearing a black judicial robe. The folder in Vanessa's hands dropped straight to the floor. Her attorney turned to look at her, and in that single moment understood that she had never once investigated the identity of the man she had chosen to destroy.
The courtroom fell into absolute silence.
The jury found her guilty on every serious charge brought against her. Every fine ever levied against James was declared completely void. The fraudulent boundary survey was permanently struck from the record. A year later, James rebuilt on the exact same foundation his father had once chosen. Same timber, same footprint, same land that had never belonged to anyone but his family. Some people burn down everything they cannot control. They rarely stop to consider what survives the fire. James recused himself immediately from any ruling on the substance of the case. But before stepping down, he issued one emergency administrative order, preserving every record, every email account, and every electronic device belonging to the association before anything could be quietly erased. The investigation that followed was methodical, thorough, and absolutely damning. A hidden camera captured footage of a figure in an association jacket carrying fuel toward the storage shed the night of the fire. Cell tower records placed Vanessa's phone at the scene before the first emergency call was ever made. A deleted folder recovered from the board treasurer's laptop was labeled simply Project Ash Acquisition, and inside it sat a pre-written statement blaming faulty wiring, drafted days before the house ever burned. A dashboard camera Vanessa herself had once installed to monitor her own staff recorded everything.